Well, this is the first effort at using YouTube and doing this lecture remotely. Now, what I said to you before in the commentary, we went up to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I want to begin today with the second page of those overheads, the one that begins President of the Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic, and then read down to the big break where it says first post-Soviet president. All right. So after um, Gorbachev resigns on Christmas of 1991, and the Soviet Union is no more, Yeltsin, as early as January 1992, issues that reform package that's listed there. He got a lot of help and a lot of support from advisors who had worked with some of the East European countries that had begun this process of transition from the command economy of the Soviet era to a more capitalist economy. And these are Western advisors, West German, British, French, Americans, lots of Americans there. And they were pushing a very neoliberal agenda in terms of economics, concept of laissez-faire, very limited government control, because the Soviet system was obviously one of a command economy where the Soviet Party and the government controlled everything. This is also called the Washington Consensus, because all of the West European countries and the United States all had been following this kind of concept of neoliberalism at the time. So they pushed this package of reforms, and this is also called shock therapy. The idea was to shock the system, to destroy the remnants of the Soviet economic system, and provide the therapy, as they assumed it would be therapy, of this capitalist economic system. And that's what they pushed. And here's some of the things that go along with the shock therapy concept. They wanted to have very tight fiscal discipline to avoid the large budget deficits that had characterized the Soviet policy in the past. They wanted to redirect their spending, public spending, away from state subsidies, because the state was subsidizing all the enterprises, and they wanted to move it towards private business. They want to institute a new system of tax reform that would be able to bring revenue into the central government. They wanted to privatize and move from the state-controlled industries to privatization and push that concept. And finally, they were lifting price controls, and they lifted them gradually, but many of the items that were regulated, basic food items, basic supplies, transportation services, all had price controls from the Soviet system, and they were eliminated. Well, what happened was that the, the store shelves quickly began to fill up with supplies, but people had trouble being able to pay for those supplies. They had trouble because without the state subsidies, the factories and industries couldn't operate, and they were slowly closing down. So on one hand, they're pushing this neoliberal economic agenda, but the impact on the average worker and the average factory is that they're closing down, they're laying off workers, and people's savings were gone. And so it became a very difficult time for the people, the average people living in the new post-Soviet era. Now, what they tried to do was to create this capitalist economy overnight. And they came up with this idea of giving every citizen a voucher, a piece of paper that said it was worth 10,000 rubles, which was not a lot of money. We're talking, I think it was equivalent to $20, $30 or something at the time. People didn't know what to do with these vouchers. They had no experience of buying stock in companies that were trying to run as private enterprises. Everyone got them, And one of my prized possessions of the Soviet era is that one of my former students, uh, her grandmother or grandfather, somebody still had their voucher, and she gave it to me, and I have it actually framed because I didn't want to just keep bringing it to classes and then having students rub their hands. So I had a photocopy, a good photocopy of both front and back, and I framed that. So people don't know what to do with these certificates, but there were some smart entrepreneurs in the Soviet system that knew what to do with them. They knew that if they collected them, they could use those as cash to buy these industries that were being privatized. Now you have to think back a minute to Gorbachev's reforms. Remember, he was pushing the idea of forming cooperatives. So many of the people who became the super rich, the so-called oligarchs under the Yeltsin period, were these younger party members. They were all part of the party, but they were looking to take advantage of these economic opportunities created by the by the cooperative law that was passed. Now, so there were a lot of these people that were looking to take advantage. They had done research. They understood what capitalism meant. They saw this as a great opportunity. Most of the workers, most of the Soviet citizens didn't know what to do with the vouchers. So the factory managers often held meetings with their workers and said, look, you know me, I have been the manager of this factory for 10 years. I've always looked out for your interests and our interests. Give me your vouchers. Bring them in. Let me take them and let me use them to protect our factory from being bought up by these voracious Western capitalists that are going to come in and try to rape our economy and steal all these resources. Well, I guess this is somewhat of a human nature issue. The managers took those vouchers and often then acted as if they were the owners of the factories because they had the paper that said they could control these factories. That's not exactly what the reformers had in mind. There was other instances of, we go back to these entrepreneurs, young people who were looking to find economic advancement and had taken advantage of the cooperatives that were created during the Gorbachev era. Many of these decided they were going to create a bank. Now, there were very limited banking laws because the only banks in the Soviet Union were state-run banks. So you had people who decided they'd go and find an empty storefront, and they'd move in there and they'd call it, the Mullen Bank. And they'd send people out around the country to buy up these vouchers. And people were coming back into Moscow with shopping bags full of vouchers. They're going out in the countryside, going to the collective farms, going to the small towns, giving people rubles that they could use to buy food stocks that were now becoming more plentiful in the stores and scarce items. Give them a bottle of vodka sometimes, and people turned over their vouchers. And so the reformers are trying to create a stock market and a way to create companies. And they begin to privatize these state-run factories. But who's going to manage this process of privatization? And who's going to they held auctions of these public assets, these factories and mines and oil fields and etc. And I'm sorry, that was didn't plan on having my sister give me a call during the middle of this. Okay, so the economy, you have the factory managers, also called the red managers, because their heart was back in the Soviet Union. But they also saw an opportunity to advance themselves running these factories as if they were their own factories. And you have these individual entrepreneurs who were amassing vouchers and building resources that way. Another way some of these oligarchs made their money is they would turn around, all of them, almost all of them are college graduates. They'd go back uh, to people they had contacts with from school. As for example, maybe one of their former professors happened to be a minister in this new government that was being created. So they'd often go up to their old college professor and say, "Hey, professor, remember me? I was in your class in world politics, and I'm now starting a bank. And now that you are the minister, let's say, of forestries, you have millions of rubles in your budget that is sitting in a state bank that does no benefit to you or to anyone else. Why don't you put them in my bank that I'm opening up and will give you a certain interest rate? Often we would give you a little taste, as they call it, under the table. We'd give you some money." So they'd go back to these contacts in the government, people they knew, and the ministers weren't signing off and letting private enterprises take state money and put it into private banks. And then, of course, when they held the auctions of these state enterprises, the private banks were the one who carried out the auctions. And so it became a very rigged process that, I create a bank overnight. I get the state money being deposited into my bank, and then I turn around and I use that state money to buy an oil field that's going up on an auction, or a certain number of factories that are going up, or an oil or a gas company that is being created, and I buy it up, not using my money because I don't have any money, but I do have access to the state fund. Now that's how the Russian oligarchs are created. Some of them came out of factory managers. Some of them took advantage of the voucher privatization. Others took advantage of their contacts to use state funds to buy these privatized industries that are being offered. And they were offering them at rock bottom prices. I mean, they were paying kopecks on the rubles, or kopecks on the dollars, which is nothing to something. And the vast majority of the people in the country were hurting. People weren't getting paid. Because remember, everyone was working as state employees, and now the state had no money, and they're trying to privatize. So you had instances where miners often came into Moscow with their mining hats on and sat down and did sit-ins. Teachers weren't being paid. Can you imagine? We talk about people having trouble in the U.S. economy before this coronavirus, going from paycheck to paycheck. But can you imagine not being paid for months on end? How difficult it was for the families of most of the average Russians to survive. So the overall impact of the shock therapy, as one wag, Strobe Tolbert, who was an aide to Clinton, said, the problem with shock therapy, there was a lot of shock and very little therapy. So the average Russian was suffering, but some people were doing very, very well. These people became the oligarchs, or what we often find in literature called the new Russians, the Russians that have money. All right, when I was there in 2000 with my son, we were walking around and I was asking him his impressions, and he said, "There's a lot of old men walking around in very nice suits with young women on their arms." And these were the old men, in his estimation. These were the men who had been taking advantage of the system and were buying up property and could afford to have young mistresses on their arms as they walked around. And people in the city would see this. They'd see how the reform was not benefiting the average citizen. One of my good friends, we were walking in St. Petersburg along the canals one day. He turned to me and he said, "Frank, you Americans have given democracy a bad name. because what we see here is not rule by the people, but we see rule by wealthy people. And we see the only people benefiting by this transition from communism to supposedly democracy is leading to a new oligarchy, a new group of people who are running the country in their interest, not our interest. All right, now we have to come back again to the Gorbachev period and remember when we talked about the Congress of People's Deputies. That was that legislature, the parliament that Gorbachev created with the expectation that this was going to be a way that he could push forward his economic reforms and his democratization effort. That Congress of People's Deputies of Russia, the Russian Federation, which is the official name of the former Russian Soviet Federated Socialist Republic. That legislature, that Duma, if you will, of the Congress of People's Deputies, was all elected back in the Soviet era, just as Yeltsin was elected president of this Russian Socialist Federated Republic in the Soviet era. And that the membership of that legislature, the Congress of People's Deputies of the Russian Federation, was dominated by communists and these new Russian nationalists that were coming to the fore with the collapse of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. And the communists and the nationalists were forming what they called the Red-Brown Alliance in the Congress. The Reds obviously the communists, and you know where the Browns come from? Not Cleveland, but from the Nazi era, the brown shirts of the original Nazi party. So you get this extreme nationalist and communists forming this alliance in the legislature and putting pressure on the Yeltsin government to make changes that will help the people. And of course, Yeltsin and his advisors and the people close to him were continuing to push the reforms. Western advisors over there were fearful that this Red-Brown Alliance in the Congress of People's Deputies could overthrow the Yeltsin government. So there was a lot of tension building and a lot of back and forth, give and take between these two sides, trying to reach some accommodation. And they can't agree. They can't accommodate each other. They can't make any agreement. And so I call your attention down here to the bottom of that page on October 4th. Yeltsin ordered an attack upon the White House. Now, first of all, the White House is not a house. It's an office building on the Moscow River, across from the hotel I used to like to stay in, the Ukraina Hotel. This White House is must be about 12, 15 stories high. It's an office building, but it became the seat of the legislature, the Duma, the Congress of People's Deputies. And as such, as the tension through 92 and 93 grew more and more between the legislature and the president and his administration, in September of 93, the legislature voted to I'm having trouble finding the word, to impeach. How can I forget that after what we've gone through in this country? They voted to impeach President Yeltsin and elected his vice president as the president. Now, we haven't talked much about the vice president, but if you remember, again, we have to think back to the Gorbachev period when he pushed for this Congress of People's Deputies. And Gorbachev became the president of the USSR. He had a vice president with him. And if you look at the one overhead that I sent, the July 10th, 1991, the RSFSR presidential election, you'll see that Boris Yeltsin ran as an independent. 91, remember, Soviet Union still in existence. He ran as an independent with a man named Alexander Rutskoy. Rutskoy was a Air Force officer that had served in the Afghan campaign, and he wanted to, do away with the Soviet Union. He realized how corrupt and inefficient it was, and he and Yeltsin linked up. But as Yeltsin kept pushing for the shock therapy and seeing the consequences for the average citizen, what was happening, Rutskoy moved more and more to side with the leaders of the Congress of People's Deputies, the legislature, against Yeltsin. So in September of 93, the legislature impeaches Yeltsin and votes in or accepts Rutskoy or swears him in as the new president. And this went on for 2 days. Yeltsin ordered the military into Moscow. That provoked the supporters of the legislature to rush to the White House to barricade it, just as it had been barricaded uh, before the coup in 91, when the citizens of Moscow rallied to the legislature and barricaded it. So now Yeltsin has the military in the city, and the supporters of the parliament are barricaded in the White House, and eventually, on October 4th, Yeltsin orders the attack on the White House. He had to convince the military to do that. They were very reluctant to fire on citizens. However, what really provoked Yeltsin was that some of the supporters of the legislature tried to capture this huge television tower and production facility on a hill in Moscow, the Ostankino Tower. And when they tried to take it over, the guards who were there fired on them, and there was a battle. Several people killed, 2 dozen people killed in a battle for the control of this television tower. Now, the supporters of the legislature were driven back, but Yeltsin had his government was in control. He used this as a claim that this is a beginning of a civil war. The military had to step in, or it would get out of hand. And so, on October 4th, the military fired on the White House, the very symbol of resistance to the coup of 91, now is under attack by this new, supposedly reformed government. And of course, the military break in, they arrest the leaders of the parliamentary opposition, and Yeltsin throws them into jail, and it looks like in late October, early November, that Yeltsin is in control of the country, and he's got no opposition. And he, despite the ongoing battle between Parliament and Yeltsin, there were several commissions, one that Parliament created, one that Yeltsin created, some independent people were working on creating a new constitution. Because remember, what constitution are they following? The only laws they were following were the laws that were created in the Soviet era. The 77 constitution that came in with Brezhnev, when he was talking about developed socialism and all that good stuff. Well, that constitution was so out of date, you had to create a new constitution that was going to reflect a more capitalist economy. And Yeltsin is pushing for this a new constitution, but essentially after the seizure of the White House, or what is called the October Days. Now, that's not the October Revolution, but the October Days are the conflict between Yeltsin and the parliament. He's now in charge. He's in a dominant position. He is going on, and people around him, not he personally, but his advisors and supporters are writing a new constitution that is going to be the Constitution of the Russian Federation. That constitution is critically important. And before I talk about that, I need to go back again to April of 1993, when there's tension between the president and the parliament are really getting out of hand. The only effort at compromise was that both sides agreed in April of '93 that they would hold a national referendum to get the sense of the Russian citizens. What do people want? And I have sent you the one page um, of those handouts that I mailed to you is on the April '93 referendum. The first question was asked, do you have confidence in the president? The answer was 59.9% yes, 40.1% no. A very strong endorsement of having confidence in the president, despite the fact that their economic conditions were poor and people were struggling. They were still hopeful that Yeltsin would bring a better future. Second question, do you support the social and economic policies of the government? That's the Yeltsin government. Less support, but still a majority. 54.3% yes, 45.7% no. The third question, do you favor early elections for the president? On this, the vote is 48.8% yes, 51.2% no. And why is that? It gets back to the response to the first one. They have confidence in Yeltsin and his government. Despite the chaos, they have confidence. So while the parliament is saying we speak for the people of Russia, the people of Russia in the April referendum seem to side with Yeltsin. The final question was, do you favor early elections for the parliament? And here it's overwhelmingly 69.1% say yes, 30.9% say no. They want to have a new parliament elected that hopefully is going to be reflective and supportive of Yeltsin. Well, and I remember this well, that the campaign thing of the time that the Yeltsin put out, and you'll remember this phrase, da, niet, da. Da, niet, da. Yes, we support the president. 2, we support his principles. No, we don't want an early election of the president. And yes, we do want an early election for the parliament. All right? So, parliament's digging in their heels. We talked about the events around October. Yeltsin puts out a new constitution, has to go up for vote, and they hold a national referendum. Look at the bottom of that page we're referring to, on December 12, 1993, in which parliamentary elections are held, and on the ballot is a question, do you approve of this new constitution, the 1993 Yeltsin-era constitution? I also sent you the report, I believe, looking here, of the election results, maybe not, of the '93 legislative vote. All right, so in this vote, why Yeltsin gets a surprise? Because while a party called Russia's Choice, that is pro-Yeltsin, comes in with the largest number of delegates, 96, the next largest number of delegates to this new legislature, 70, are from a party that has a very strange title, Liberal Democratic Party. A party that is not liberal and not very democratic. This is a very nationalistic, proto-fascist party led by a man we'll talk a little bit more about later, Vladimir Zhirinovsky. And so the third largest party that comes in, guess what? The Communist Party of the Russian Federation. Since the Communist Party of the Soviet Union has been banned, and they have reconstituted themselves as communist parties in the various republics. These are now independent countries. The Communist Party in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Kazakhstan, in Russia. Now is the third largest party. There is a party called the Agrarian Party that is basically a party of peasants, but largely directed by the leaders of the collective farms. So it's an ally of the Communist Party. So what happens after these elections? Despite the April support for Yeltsin, he's very much surprised by the composition of this new legislature he's going to face. This new now Russian Duma. We first talked about that idea with after 1905 and Nicholas II's concessions to the revolutionaries. We now have a new legislature that is going to be elected under this new constitution that is passed, accepted by the Russian people in December of 93. But the tension between the legislature and president is still going to continue in 1993. Now that's 30 minutes of possibly rambling, but I think you can follow it. I have a lot more things we've got to cover, but I'm going to stop here because I want to be sure that this can be uploaded all right. And then when I send you some information on Monday, I'll be able to tell you the links. So I'll work on this one. I'm going to end this now, and then I'll pick up another one that will continue on after the Russia in 1994. Okay? I'll be back soon.